Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation and for the introduction. Exactly, so we're going to talk a bit about, first, automation. We're going to get a little bit dramatic, empirically and theoretically, and then we'll talk a bit about autonomy and how we can eventually negotiate a position in between.
And is it on?
Do you have to maybe...
1, 2, 3. Oh, great. No, and we expand also the idea of wearables, since you will see everything we think which you carry with you, and it carries you is part of the debate. And yes, it is. Thank you so much for the introduction as well. I'll give you a little into of not what we do, because we're not like doing professional products. We are actually undesigning or taking things apart to critically investigate with students all the ethical, moral debates about technologies. And maybe just a few slides on where we work. That's the Berlin Open Lab. That's really, I think, wonderful endeavor between the TU Berlin and the UdK Berlin. And it is, you can call it an academic maker space. So yes, we do tinker, we do basteln. Best case, we do undesign.
Best case.
Undesign, so we do take things apart. Actually, all these devices, which are for us very much black boxes and are sealed, and we don't understand the technologies we're trying to understand. So it also goes in the realm of digital literacy. And yes, the intersection which you see here, I come more from the art and design area, Michelle from social science and conflict studies, and we met 15 years ago. I always say 12, and then she says it's 15. It's 15, right? Yes, in a bar slash cultural center in Amsterdam, and it was sort of, she as a sociologist was really annoyed that the research which she was doing doesn't see the day of light, just academic papers and just a very narrow audience. And I, as a designer at that time, late 90s, I think I'm that old.
Well, that was not 15 years ago. He obviously can't calculate.
I'm not a professor for math or anything else. But I think what was important for me that we, as designers, didn't reflect enough about how processes are. And at that time, it was about like either working for the industry or for the cultural sector. So we thought about we have to break that narrative of design a bit. And yeah, as you mentioned, we are actually sharing a visiting professorship at the TU, and we're sharing the research lead at the UdK Weizenbaum. Gesche Just is here as well, so we're working with her on the UdK side, and we're trying to...
And on the ECDF side.
Exactly, so we're trying to... that looks very straight on graphic. It is much more entangled.
That's exactly our work hours.
Talking about automation versus autonomy. But yes, and so the Berlin Open Lab, why it's so important to show you this for a moment, because later when we show you some examples of student works, of critical inquiries, it is really we're using rapid prototyping, ad hoc making in this lab, using open source microcontrollers and so forth. And I think the attitude of the Berlin Open Lab in general, where different research groups are situated, is, as you can see, a lot of open access, open data, open culture, open innovation, and open source. And of course, we're debating about the spectrum of openness and closeness and the overlaps and what we have to revolutionize within the academic system. And that's our little corner, just where we work. We have 3 focus points, I would say, and overlaps. The one is gender and diversity. I think Michelle brought that through her former studies with here, I think with the focus on trans-feminist hacking approaches to technology. So they're raising debates of who's even part of the privacy debates, who's even part of creating this big tech, which we will also talk today about. And then we have another focus on post-Western centrism. Means like we're working a lot with colleagues from Togo and Ghana together to look at different visions of digitalization and different pathways of I wouldn't say ideologies, but ways of thinking. And as the third one, I give over to Michelle.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, the post-Anthropocene is still an imaginary, but I think goes very much with the other 2 categories, are thinking about way of living on this Earth before we're trying to escape to the next planet, in a way with our co-species, and that's, of course, also very embedded in the way we design things, technologies and products. So, shortly, I get to do the dramatic part, most of it. One perspective on how we can think about the politics of design and technology, what we usually come from is the point what we design designs us back. So, of course, from the stone to the phone, from the very first tools that we made, they've been designing us physically, mentally. They've changed how we perceive things, how we can imagine things, right? We know that about our tools. And within that process, we've had a tendency to do that in a very anthropomorphic way. So we like to design things in our own image. Humans really somehow like to do that, from the way things behave to the way they look. You might know this quite old example from Professor Ishiguro from Osaka University, who designed himself as an android. So he has this replacement who can also go and give lectures for him and, replace him. He also designed the Geminoid F some years later. She's rumored to be his research assistant. Nobody's really sure. But she can be bought for $100,000 and is recommended for the service industry since she has such a polite smile, gender undertone. In the same way, we also even produce avatars, for instance, in the case here, little Michaela, who we know are avatars. She's an avatar. She's not real. She has over 3 million followers on Instagram, so we even follow this image, although we know that it's not even really human, and take photos with them. I find that kind of an interesting, maybe projection of humanness on technology. And I think Willem Flusser said it very nicely in his book, The Shape of Things, where he asked, isn't it interesting that we design robots in our own image and then we start dancing like them? And this was the 80s. We literally were dancing like them. This is not against Rihanna. This is just to illustrate. So, as we know by now, as we've talked about today, by now we're all cyborgs. Donna Haraway said it already in 1985. Technology is in us, on us, between us, from wearables to smart city grids in every way. So whether we see that like this is Neil Harbison, who's a transhumanist body hacker. So he can't see colors. You might know this example. So he has this device built into the back of his head, so he can hear colors. He's a very close colleague, also a transhumanist activist, Moon Ribas, built into her own feet seismic sensors, so she can feel seismic activity. She can feel that while she walks around, or in her case, while she dances. The more extreme examples. Or if we come here to Berlin, to our own cyborg e.V., we have Enno Park, who hacked his own hearing aid in order to have beyond human hearing. But he did that by himself, because when things are hackable, we can think about what extensions mean. Or if we just think of this, which I think might represent a lot of us right now, also here today. Or I would say the everyday cyborg, even if we think of this, also famous image from John Stanmeyer of migrants on the coast of Djibouti trying to get signal home. So, of course, when we think about the everyday cyborg, it's a lifeline for a lot of us in a lot of different ways. And when we talk about privacy, which we've been doing today, tracking also has different dangers depending on the context you're in. So within doing all of this, we've always had a tendency, if you look at sort of new technologies, to design a lot of bias into these things. This is an image from Blade Runner 2049, where you see the image of the AI, the very sexy female AI. But also beyond fiction, we also know this from the voice assistants. This is actually the woman behind Siri. This is how Siri really looks in the first voice. But we know that all of these voice assistants, for instance, when they got designed, were all designed with female voices. Now we have the choice, but we have the choice if we're belonging to the 7 most common languages in the world. So not even talking about the languages that aren't represented. The female assistant. It was apparently more comfortable and trustworthy, users said. And that gets further embodied. This is an example from Japan, from Gatebox, where you have a little hologram instead. She also sends you sexy text messages during the day and twirls when you come home. This is becoming actually also a very broad tendency, having avatar girlfriends, technical avatar girlfriends in many places in the world, especially in East Asia. Or the even more extreme embodiment, this is Harmony 3.0 from Realbotics, who is an artificially intelligent sex doll. Now, why do we talk about sex dolls when we talk about extensions? Maybe here just to say, beyond this embodiment of gender, what I think Harmony is a good example of is that although you can choose any color for what Harmony wears, and you can choose any personality, really, from the app, which controls her, you can choose between 7 skin colors. There is no reason to design race into this, but we do. So that was part of the drama?
Yes, exactly, accelerating to this. And I think we touched upon this. I think also the examples show about when we're thinking about the rise now of the therapy bots, the things we talked about, like our body data tracking, our pulse tracking, all this intimate data, I think we have not yet or we can't grasp the consequences of the inventions we make. So we always try to go backwards and try to correct. So in the end, as you know the default voices and voice assistants, and then they add a diversity layer, and we're trying to, as humans, I think, trying to fix always these things and can't get behind. This is not saying negative against innovation, but it's an interesting phenomenon. And of course, if here, this is the server park from Facebook, I think it was quite interesting with our minuscule movements and swipes and step countings. I think we're having this really interesting hidden infrastructures of servers running behind that. And I think these infrastructures we usually don't see, or we should definitely consider the energy consumption of all of this. Yeah, that's an example of ELIC. Another dramatic thing I find, or very, very important issue, is the electronic trash as well. What happens to these devices when we wear them? I think this is the site of Abu Ghoshi in Ghana. It's an electronic site where the inhabitants trying to get the copper out of the devices. And I think you maybe experience similar things like I do. The moment that there's a new device, already the next one is coming in the next half year. And before we even understood how to use a smartwatch or this smartphone or that smartphone, it's already being replaced by the next thing. So this dimension, and yeah, I think, looks like a beautiful image, but this is then the space trash. So while we're actually thinking, not we, but the people from Amazon and Tesla of going into space and inventing space travel, we haven't cleaned up the mess we created in the first place. And as designers, we're very interested in objects, what these objects do, what they can tell us, and if we should continue designing in that way.
Yeah, so in times where things are knowing and suggesting and predicting, and as we've also heard about today, we can ask ourselves, to what extent are things extending us, and to what extent do we become the extensions of the extensions that we built in the way that they work right now sometimes? And who's making the visions? This is the front page of Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord, the situationist. And this is a slightly newer image, still old, you might know very well. But I think that says a lot. And this is an image from Julian Bleeker's Near Future Laboratory. It's actually quite an old image. It's still quite, I think 2009, still quite representative today. And we've had a lot of this in the humanities. I'm throwing some quotes at you now just to say we do know this theoretically. I mean, 1985, Informatics of Domination from Donna Haraway saying we're moving from an organic industrial society to a polymorphous information society, and we don't even have the categories to start understanding what we're creating and living in right now. Rosie Braidotti's posthumanism talks about the capitalization of living matter, now that we're talking about data from wearables, biodata being tracked, right? And she says a whole new level of biopolitical governmentality as data banks of biogenetic, neural, and mediatic information about individuals include profiling practices that amount to life mining. So she goes from data mining to life mining. Of course, got very popular. Sure, we've all had some interaction with the theories of Shoshana Zuboff, surveillance capitalism. She, of course, takes it to the state where she says automated machine processes not only know our behavior, but shape it, right? So the reorientation from knowledge to power no longer just automates information flows about us, but begins to automate us. Just saying, we're not the only ones saying. We might be getting automated, or even the more extreme data colonialism by people like Nick Coldry and Ulysses Mayas, who are saying it's the capitalization of life without limit right now, and not only are we doing it to ourselves, we're doing it globally right now with our way of collecting, understanding, and designing. So the question becomes, and then we'll get to the hopeful part, Willem Flüsser again, what do we have to do before we become, as he puts it, programmed by the programmers who have been programmed? Drama. Okay.
Yes, I wonder if
then it gets less dramatic.
That's the hopeful part. But I think this is also like resembles a bit the title, because I don't think it's autonomy versus automation. I think we're grappling. It's like a tug of war, which each individual is trying to negotiate, and we had it today. Negotiate with oneself when it comes to those more intimate technologies. But just a few examples of a pedagogical experiment we were allowed to do 3 years ago. We opened our courses up to the biggest universities in Berlin in order to find students from different backgrounds to make an inter or transdisciplinary post-disciplinary class. So we have students from philosophy, programming, data science, performance art, and it's really a different mixed bunch of also educational levels from BA to MA to PhD. And I think it was a very interesting experiment because they came together because they were kind of curious and concerned, and just like a little bit of way of working, as I mentioned in the beginning. I think it's really about taking things apart and making social investigations about your technologies, investigating these trackers. I mean, this is a mode of working, and then actually kind of either formulating rapid prototyping alternative views about technology, or making critiques in that matter. And that's just some examples that we're using. If you're not familiar with it, modes of laser cutting, open source robots, and so forth. But I will go into a few works just shortly. This one work is from Callum. He was a medical student, and he was really interested in this tracking when you're on your phone and your browsers. And he said it's so untangible, I cannot. And it's like 4 years ago, I think he took this course. And he thought of, okay, he would like to make it tangible. So he made this device, which is like working with an open source receipt printer and the line of code, which he figured out, which is basically, even if you have your device locked into this receipt printer, it prints out what happens in the background, even without you browsing. So the interesting thing is, this is what you see, the big line is 30 seconds of being on Yahoo, and the smallest one is, we tried it lately on Wikipedia, CIA, NSA, tried to see how we...
CIA won, would you believe it?
Well,
I didn't believe it.
It's the smallest stripe. But that's also actually more of like making those intangible concept tangible for a moment. Or that's Lucy, she was more on the sustainability debate like I talked about, and I think everyone maybe had one of those old phones, and it's also raising the debate maybe with wearables in that sense as well, how we are using these technologies or the next generations of devices or products which are already outdated. And she tried to, CPR, I think in English is the word, to bring back to life an old phone, and the old Nokia phone is on Twitter and saying I'm still alive, I think once a day.
Every 24 hours. And it is alive, that's the point. As long as this phone stays alive, it's tweeting. and it's still alive because the battery is fine. It's just not updatable. It's not smart. Yeah, so this is an example from Berkay, who was working with, in these times of like new gaming engines, augmented realities, where we can do everything. The new thing right now is like digi-couture. Don't know if you've heard about that. It's a whole fashion world where you can only buy things digitally and wear them digitally. So, influencers buy very expensive dresses, and then they can photograph themselves with them and post it on Instagram for a second. And he tried to democratize this, so he scanned them, he basically copied them and tried to make counterfeits, and made the Snapchat app that anyone can wear the copies of this digital couture in order to, again, just start a debate about where we're going with all of this. Talking about voice assistants before, Ulrike is a graphic designer from the UdK, and she was into this whole whole like default feminine voice assistants, and she wrote Rebel, which is an using Mozilla open source software, and Rebel is a feminist voice assistant. And using this, she made a panel discussion with Google's Pod, Siri, Alexa, and triggers them so by asking them questions. And I can't show it to you because this is a PDF, but they have a discussion about feminist internet and women in tech and who's represented. So it's quite beautiful because they also got different smartnesses. Siri just keeps reading what she finds on Google, basically. Alexa's a bit more smart. Google's better. It's a nice video to watch. Or if we're talking about literacy, I'm just asking for time, Toby, because otherwise I would maybe jump to the end. Oh, OK, no, we're fine then. Let's just see the last examples. This was an example from Marie Dietz and Marie Kochsig, who were working together, and they were interested in this whole collection of intimate data from fertility and period tracking apps, like was brought up before, because, of course, these apps, to the most extent, if you look at who's behind them, are collecting this data about us, very intimate data about us, I say now as women, and putting us in an advertising cycle where the first part of your cycle, you get lipstick and sexy underwear advertising. The second part, you get cushions and plants because you're seen as being, like nesting in the second part, and so. And, it's very essentializing. So in order to even create a discussion about this, they took tech apart and put it together again, laser pointers and things, DVD players, and created all sorts of like make-at-home microscopes. And basically, if you spit on this microscope and take a picture with your phone, you get this graphic, which you see in the corner, which is ferning, which is a very simple photograph. But if you follow them throughout your cycle, you can see when you're ovulating, when your estrogen levels are up, just from the pattern. As you can see, it's a bit like snowflakes on a glass window. And they did this also not just also to talk about literacy, to understand like body literacy and digital literacy, and to raise the debate when we're just collecting all this data and following these predictions, but we don't really understand our own bodies. So that was more like a awareness raising. Or this also DIY data project by Julia Zina. Julia was interested in sleep tracking. So she went in and engaged extensively with sleep tracking apps for 2 weeks and realized all of these paradoxes in them. Like, they say, you should take all the technology out of your room to sleep well. Please put the iPhone closer to your body. And she was like, what should I do now? And then she tried these apps, and they said, please activate audio, and she did so. And the next day, they had taped, her sounds at night, her snoring, and they were like, please buy the premium version to access this data. And she was like, it's my snoring. So she built these DIY sensors, which you can put on your body, and the graphic you see is, it then makes a graphic out of your sleep pattern. So basically also a literacy project to understand how these things are actually collected. She wrote the Python script that you can basically DIY sleep track, but not by giving your data to these apps. And also just to understand what's behind these systems.
I think we have 2 more, but I'll do them quite quick. Yeah, this was Pablo, who was really interested in completely engaging differently with data to maybe like overcome our own assumption about things. And he was really interested in air quality and climate change. And on our fancy phones, you see how the air quality is, and it's these graphics, and they're very untangible. So he was interested in changing the senses, maybe. So he made this little device where you can actually listen to air pollution while you walk through the city. I think it's a debate space of sometimes how we intend maybe a certain use for things, and we get maybe too used to it, and that we can change the perception on those things. And we end with a wearable. That is Aaron, also I think a very poetic work. During the semester he wanted to bend time. I said, wow, okay, that's a big task. And he said, like...
He's an engineer.
He is an engineer, so I trusted him to do so. But he was interested in actually kind of deconstructing the way we are living our pace and the value set of it. So he was trying to make a watch which is correlates to the climate change. So rather, so with the urgency and emergency patterns, where he downloaded the open source data from the last years of the climate change, and he said it's too untenable. Temperature change. He made this watch to be more in the pace with the planet rather than the time we are operating right now. And it's kind of a dramatic watch as well.
It is, but he came to class on time. So just to round up, on the automation front, we're being increasingly, we would say, we're being increasingly automated, read, analyzed, predicted, and produced by the systems we designed. So not they did it to us. We did it to us, and the things we upload if we're uncritical. On the autonomy front, we would say there is a negotiation space for more autonomy or social self-sovereignty of the individual, and this might emerge through digital literacy and critical self-reflection. It is, though, like Florian said, always a negotiation. I would say we wouldn't believe in any of them completely. But what we're kind of interested in right now, what we're trying out, is what we showed you very shortly now, is this critical design inquiries to see if that's a methodology to practice this negotiation. So what we're showing you are not attempting to be solutions, they're attempting to be negotiations. What we're trying to do with these students and in our own work is actually try to capture, name, formulate somehow what's happening right now while it's happening. And that's actually the methodology.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your insight to your work. Because we're running a little bit late, we're moving the discussion of what you offered us into the great panel discussion right at the end, which is setting up 5 chairs. I don't think we have 5 minutes. I think 2 or 3 minutes are okay. We're just setting this up real quickly and resume and end this event actually with the panel discussion with all the people that you've seen on stage, plus one more, whom I'm going to introduce you to in a minute, and start off with the discussion of your work. So see you in a bit. Thank you so much again, Michelle Christensen, Florian Conradi. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.